Listen closely, because this part of American history was never meant to reach your ears. The official records of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, tell one story, a tale of 4 tragic deaths between 1837 and 1841. But the truth was buried under layers of inheritance law, religious silence, and blood-soaked loyalty. They called it coincidence. They called it grief. But the land remembers. The walls of the Brennan farmhouse still whisper what the archives refuse to name. 4 sisters. 4 weddings. 4 graves. It began in the fog. A man's scream carried through the morning mist, cut short by the sound of hooves. Then silence. The next day, the townspeople found Thomas Hennessy's body beside the road, his neck broken, his face frozen in terror. They said his horse threw him, but anyone who had seen Bridget Brennan's eyes the night before knew better. The Brennans were no ordinary women. Their father, Patrick Brennan, had built his American empire on soil that had been stolen from Irish despair. He told his daughters that the land was sacred, worth killing for, worth dying for. And when he died without a son, that sacred inheritance became a curse. By law it was to be divided, but by blood it was to be protected. The sisters understood one truth: men owned the law, so the law must be manipulated through men. Bridget, the eldest, was the strategist, a woman who smiled with her mouth but calculated with her silence. Catherine, the empath. She could sense weakness like a predator smells blood. Margaret, the angel of deception, her beauty crafted for conquest. And Sarah, the youngest, an actress born from necessity, capable of shifting her soul into any role the world demanded. Together, they formed a covenant older than Scripture to remain whole, no matter the cost. In Lancaster County's stone churches, priests blessed their vows. In the county courthouse, clerks stamped their marriage papers. And within the farmhouse walls, they whispered the true ceremony. A pact of unity sealed not by rings, but by the acceptance of murder as survival. You've heard of family loyalty, but you haven't seen what happens when loyalty becomes doctrine. When faith turns into possession. These sisters didn't pray for deliverance. They became their own gods. And as the fog rolled across the Pennsylvania fields, their first offering was prepared. The county believed it was an accident. The Brennan sisters knew it was a beginning. By the spring of 1838, the Brennan farmhouse stood like a fortress against the countryside. Stone walls, thick shutters, the scent of wood smoke and secrets. Bridget wore black for her late husband. But beneath the veil, she was already rebuilding the family's dominion. Hennessy's death had freed the sisters from taxation, from debt, from male oversight. His wealth, his name, even his legal influence. All of it had been absorbed into the Brennan Trust, the quiet mechanism that would ensure the land never left their hands. And Lancaster County's finest men were too busy admiring the sisters' poise to see the pattern forming. Catherine was next to marry. She chose Hamilton Crawford, the county banker whose signature could decide a man's rise or ruin. He was precise, disciplined, utterly predictable. The perfect target for Catherine's slow and deliberate charm. She approached him not with seduction, but with vulnerability, a strategy born from instinct and calculation. He believed he was rescuing her. In truth, he was stepping into a design already sealed by candlelight. The night their father was buried, Crawford wrote in his private ledger that Catherine had the face of an angel and the will of a sovereign. But even angels, he would later learn, can orchestrate damnation. The sisters treated the new husband as they had treated the first, welcoming, respectful, submissive. But behind closed doors, the tone shifted. They controlled his schedule, monitored his meetings, and gradually redirected his banking influence toward the consolidation of their estate. And then, when his usefulness began to wane, when he started to suspect, to question, nature intervened. Ice on Mill Creek cracked beneath his boots. His body was found face down in the current. Frozen hands still clutching the walking stick Catherine had gifted him. The county doctor called it a tragic accident. The priest called it God's will. The sisters called it progress. But if you've studied power long enough, you know this pattern: wealth attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny invites fear. The Brennans' mourning was short, precise, rehearsed. 2 husbands gone, 2 fortunes secured, 2 coffins laid into earth consecrated by lies. People whispered, of course. They always do when beauty and misfortune dance together. Yet no one dared accuse them, because even then, beneath the lace and the piety, those women carried an energy that unsettled men. They didn't grieve like widows, they moved like monarchs. And somewhere deep in that farmhouse, their third plan was already being written. By the autumn of 1839, the Brennan sisters had learned how to weaponize tragedy. Their mourning dresses became armor, their tears currency. Lancaster's elite men pitied them, adored them, underestimated them. Every death brought new invitations, new influence, new wealth discreetly folded into the family trust. But now came the most dangerous phase, the one that required finesse rather than force. Margaret Brennan, the third sister, had been groomed for this moment since childhood. Where Bridget commanded and Catherine persuaded, Margaret conquered through illusion. Her beauty was so refined, so delicate, that men saw what they wanted to believe. Innocence. Her target was Judge Cornelius Whitman, the most powerful man in Lancaster County. His signature decided inheritances, his judgment sculpted reputations, and his word could silence any legal suspicion. A man like that could destroy the Brennan legacy with one stroke of a pen, or protect it forever. Margaret chose the latter. She first appeared in his courtroom as a humble petitioner, seeking guidance on her father's estate, but what began as consultation became ritual. She visited every week, never too often to appear desperate, never too rarely to be forgotten. She asked questions with careful naivety, smiled when appropriate, and always departed leaving the faint scent of lavender and regret. Whitman was captivated, not by her words, but by the way she looked at him, as though he were the last moral man in a world gone corrupt. He didn't realize she was studying him, learning the rhythm of his ego, the fracture lines in his conviction. By winter, he had proposed marriage. The county rejoiced, an esteemed judge uniting with a woman of grace and virtue. It was seen as divine providence, a reward for his years of service. But beneath that sanctified veneer, Margaret was already reconfiguring the family's legal structure. She convinced the judge to review Patrick Brennan's old will, to ensure the sisters' protection. In doing so, she gained access to every hidden clause, every loophole of Pennsylvania inheritance law. 3 weddings, 3 funerals. The whispers began to stir again. Quiet, nervous laughter at dinner tables, servants crossing themselves when the sisters' names were mentioned, yet no one dared speak openly. The Brennan women attended every funeral mass, every charity event, every church service, their faces composed, their hands folded. But at night, behind the stone walls of the farmhouse, Margaret would pour wine into 4 crystal cups, raise her glass, and whisper to her sisters, "One more, and the circle is complete." By 1840, Lancaster County had stopped calling it coincidence, at least behind closed doors. 4 men of influence, bound to the same family, now lay in the earth within the span of 3 years. Their widows, instead of retreating into quiet despair, ruled the Brennan farm with precision more befitting a syndicate than a household. Yet outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. They gave to the church, employed half the township, hosted Sunday suppers for clergymen and judges alike. But within that great stone farmhouse, something darker than ambition had begun to take root, a belief that they had transcended law itself. Sarah, the youngest, was changing, always the gentle one, the soft voice that soothed suspicion. She had begun to speak in ways that unsettled even her sisters. "The land chooses," she would say, her voice distant, dreamlike. "It takes what it needs. We just guide its hunger." Bridget laughed the first few times she heard it. But in the months that followed, even she began to wonder if their inheritance had awakened something. An ancient loyalty older than their bloodline. The fourth man came from outside Lancaster, Sheriff Elijah Rowan, a Protestant widower sent to investigate the coincidences surrounding the Brennan property. The county wanted reassurance, not justice, but Rowan was too thorough, too honest. He questioned servants, reviewed wills, even spoke privately with the parish priest who'd performed the funerals. And each night, he returned to the farmhouse for supper, where Sarah entertained him with music, her voice trembling like glass. He told his deputy she reminded him of the innocence this world's lost. He never realized he was being studied. In February 1841, Rowan vanished. His horse was found grazing by the old well. 3 days later, his body surfaced at the bottom, half preserved in icy water. No marks of struggle, no witnesses. Officially ruled a tragic accident during an evening patrol. Unofficially, Lancaster County fell silent. The Brennans buried him with full honors, attended by clergy and county officials who all owed them favors or feared their influence. That night, the sisters gathered once more at the long oak table. No words. Only the sound of the wind pressing against the shutters, like breath behind a confession booth. Bridget poured wine into 4 cups. Sarah did not drink. She only whispered, "Now it's done." The circle's sealed. And somewhere beneath the soil of Lancaster County, the land sighed, as though it had finally been fed. After Sheriff Rowan's death, something shifted in Lancaster County's collective soul. Fear became etiquette. No one spoke the sisters' names above a whisper. Yet everyone watched their carriage glide through town, like a black omen with lace curtains. The Brennans had achieved what few families ever could. They controlled not only wealth but perception. The county's power structure, from clergy to courts, bent subtly toward them. And still, the sisters remained untouchable. 4 widows living together in immaculate isolation, their public virtue shielding private damnation. But within the farmhouse, the unity that had once bound them began to fracture under the weight of their own creation. Bridget had become distant, obsessed with maintaining appearances and managing the land's expanding income. Catherine had grown colder, spending her nights in the library poring over law books and her days inspecting tenant accounts like a magistrate. Margaret's composure faltered. She dreamed of Judge Whitman's face, swollen, pale, gasping, moments before his mysterious illness took him. And Sarah no longer spoke of inheritance or marriage. She spoke of voices. "The earth listens," she would whisper in her sleep. "It remembers the promises we made." She claimed she could hear her father's voice beneath the soil, calling not for forgiveness, but for continuation. The others dismissed it as grief until the animals began acting strangely. Horses refused to approach the well. Chickens stopped laying. At night, the cattle would bellow and thrash as though something unseen moved through the fields. Rumors spread again, quietly, fearfully. A priest sent from Philadelphia claimed the farmhouse carried a curse of the old world. He spoke of Irish legends, families who pledged their blood to land spirits in exchange for prosperity. Bridget dismissed him from the property within minutes. Yet that night, she could not sleep. The wind howled across the acres like a choir of unseen mourners. For all their wealth and influence, the sisters were beginning to understand the true cost of their covenant. They had believed themselves the masters of fate, but the pattern of deaths no longer felt orchestrated. It felt inevitable. They had fed the land with the blood of others. Now it seemed to hunger for more. On the last night of that winter, Bridget found Sarah standing barefoot in the snow, staring toward the fields. "It's not finished," Sarah said softly. "It never finishes." And in that moment, Bridget finally understood. They hadn't just inherited the land, they had inherited its hunger. Spring of 1842 arrived, and with it came the illusion of peace. The Brennan estate bloomed in impossible abundance. The crops thicker, greener, almost unnaturally so. The locals called it God's blessing, though few dared cross the property line. From a distance, the farmhouse looked idyllic, framed by budding trees and morning mist. But those who passed too near spoke of hearing murmurs, like prayers spoken backward, and the faint echo of women's voices carried through the fields long after dusk. Inside, the sisters had grown silent toward one another. Meals were taken without conversation. Candles burned low, unattended. Even the servants had begun to vanish quietly, one by one, claiming sickness or leaving in the night. Bridget tried to maintain order, insisting that all would settle with time. Yet her eyes betrayed sleeplessness. Her hands trembled when signing ledgers. The prosperity of the land was too perfect, too relentless. Corn that grew twice its height, livestock that fattened unnaturally fast, milk that curdled within hours of being drawn. Nature itself was out of rhythm. Margaret began locking herself in her room, praying feverishly and burning lavender to drive away what she called the Watchers. Catherine, ever the rational one, denied it all, until she found the old family Bible warped and blackened at its edges, its pages fused together as if from heat. On the inside cover, scrawled in a hand that none recognized, was a single phrase: "The debt must continue." Sarah, however, seemed calmer than she'd ever been. Her eyes carried a feverish serenity, and she spoke with a strange, prophetic tone. "It's not punishment," she told them one night as thunder rattled the windows. "It's inheritance. The land only wants balance." When Catherine demanded to know what she meant, Sarah simply smiled. "You'll see. It always collects what it's owed." That same week, the mill house on the edge of the property collapsed without warning, killing the foreman and 2 workers inside. The coroner called it an accident of rot. Though the beams were new and the foundation sound, Bridget ordered the site sealed and burned. But the flames refused to take it first. Smoke coiling skyward in black spirals, carrying a smell that no one could quite name. That night, a blood-red moon rose over Lancaster County. From the farmhouse window, Sarah watched in silence, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, Bridget whispered, trembling, "What have we done?" Sarah didn't turn. She only replied softly, "What our father started." By midsummer of 1842, Lancaster County's beauty had turned grotesque. The crops were still plentiful, but no one wanted to touch them. Fruit rotted from the inside out. Livestock were born twisted or still, and crows gathered by the hundreds on fence posts like an army awaiting command. People whispered that the Brennan farm was no longer blessed. It was claimed. Even the priest who had once blessed their home refused to ride past the gates, muttering that the earth itself there had memory. Inside the farmhouse, reason was collapsing. Catherine, the once logical sister, had begun to unravel. She spoke to shadows, her lips forming half prayers, half threats. She insisted she saw men walking between the corn rows at night, their faces pale and their eyes empty, each one resembling those they'd buried. The judge, the sheriff, the husbands. "They're not dead," she told Margaret one evening, trembling. "They're waiting for us." Margaret tried to calm her, but even she could hear the rustle outside, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps when no one should have been there. Bridget clung to order with desperation. She locked the doors at dusk, demanded the sisters pray before bed, forbade anyone from mentioning their father's name. But faith had long since abandoned the Brennan women. The air inside the farmhouse carried a scent of damp soil and decay, as if the grave itself had moved in. Sarah, now fully transformed by whatever communion she had formed with the land, began performing rituals in the fields. At night she would walk barefoot through the rows, chanting in Gaelic, sprinkling milk and blood on the roots. When Bridget confronted her, Sarah only smiled and said, "It's not sacrifice, it's continuation. The land needs to breathe through us." Then came the storm. On the night of July 17th, Thunder split the sky open and rain poured in black sheets. The farmhouse shook with wind so fierce it tore shingles from the roof. Lightning struck the old oak by the well, illuminating 4 figures standing in the field. Motionless, glistening with rain. Bridget screamed for her sisters to stay inside, but Sarah stepped forward, whispering, "They've come to finish it." The next morning, when the storm cleared, neighbors found the Brennan farmhouse in ruins. The windows shattered, doors open, table overturned. Only one room remained untouched, the parlor. There, on the dining table, sat 4 crystal cups, each half filled with dark water. And in the fields, the earth had been freshly turned. 4 mounds, perfectly aligned. Days after the storm, Lancaster County held its breath. No one dared enter the Brennan property, yet curiosity gnawed at the edges of fear. It was the farmhand's wife, Mrs. Coyle, who finally crossed the threshold, searching for her missing husband. She found no bodies, no signs of struggle, only silence thick enough to press against her lungs. The parlor smelled faintly of iron and lilac. The 4 cups still sat upon the table, undisturbed. The liquid inside congealed into something that looked almost alive. Dark, viscous, and faintly pulsing. When the sheriff's deputies arrived days later, they found the same eerie stillness. Furniture untouched. Candles burned to stubs. A Bible open to the Book of Ruth, though the page edges were smeared with fingerprints like soil. The well had collapsed during the storm, sealing whatever lay beneath it. As they searched the fields, they discovered something stranger still. The 4 mounds of earth where the sisters were presumed buried had begun to sprout identical black lilies. Flowers no one in the county had ever seen before. The coroner recorded the case as missing persons under mysterious circumstance. But those who lived nearby began to swear that the sisters had never truly left. Travelers reported seeing a lantern glow, moving across the property long after midnight. Farmhands who dared cut through the Brennan fields claimed to hear women's voices murmuring prayers in a foreign tongue. One man swore he saw Sarah herself by the well, barefoot and smiling faintly, her eyes dark as ink. Over time, the land changed hands, sold cheap, then cheaper still. Every new owner tried to cultivate it, and every one of them failed. Crops would bloom beautifully, only to rot before harvest. Livestock would vanish. Tools would rust overnight. By 1850, no one lived there at all. The farmhouse, though collapsing, still stood, a monument to a name the county had erased from records but not from memory. Even now, old residents tell the same story when the air turns heavy before a storm, that the Brennan sisters were not victims, nor witches, but keepers of a pact older than their bloodline. That every generation, the land hungers again, and that when the wind blows from the east, you can hear them whisper through the corn, 4 voices in perfect harmony. The debt continues. By the turn of the century, the Brennan farm had become a ghost of itself. Nothing more than blackened timber and creeping ivy. The walls leaned inward like a body folding around a secret, and the well, once the heart of the estate, was now just a moss-covered pit from which no sound ever echoed. Locals avoided the road that passed by it, choosing to take the longer route toward town, rather than feel that sudden drop in temperature that always came near the property's edge. But memory, like soil, does not stay buried. In 1898, a historian named Dr. Elias Fenn came to Lancaster to document what he called rural American folklore. He dismissed the Brennan tale as superstition until he began to cross-check property deeds and coroner records. Every 50 years, he discovered, the estate was quietly purchased by a new owner. Always a woman, always widowed, and always gone within a year. The dates aligned with seasons of drought and sudden, inexplicable storms. When Dr. Fenn visited the property himself, he brought with him a surveyor and a local priest. The 3 men descended the hill at dusk. Fenn described the experience in his final journal entry, found later in his abandoned lodging. The ground hums. Beneath the grass, I can feel it. something moving, breathing. The air carries a sweetness like decaying fruit. We found remnants of a foundation where the parlor once stood. 4 indentations in the earth, aligned perfectly north to south. The priest began to pray, but the words twisted in his mouth, as if the air itself refused to hear him. The humming grew louder until it became voices, 4 in unison, speaking words I cannot write. Sarah, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, they are not gone. The debt is awake again. None of the men were seen after that night. Their horses were found grazing near the property, their equipment scattered. The county sheriff sealed the land once more, marking it as condemned. Yet every generation, when the soil grows restless and storms come early, farmers in Lancaster swear they see lantern light moving through the ruins. Some say it's the wind, others whisper it's the sisters, still tending their cursed inheritance, still guarding the bargain their father made in blood. And if you stand there long enough, between midnight and dawn, the ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. Softly, rhythmically, like a heart still beating underground. In the early spring of 1921, the Brennan property stirred again. A railroad company had purchased several acres of forgotten farmland in Lancaster County for a new line extension, unaware or uninterested in the legends that had kept the place untouched for decades. The engineers laughed off the locals' warnings, calling the stories backwoods hysteria. Within weeks, they began digging through the overgrown fields, cutting into earth that had not been disturbed in nearly 80 years. The first sign came quietly. A laborer struck something metallic beneath the soil, an old iron locket, still gleaming despite the decay around it. Inside was a faded miniature of 4 women, their faces almost erased by time. The next morning, the foreman was found dead in his tent, his body cold, his hands and mouth full of dirt. There were no signs of struggle. The remaining crew, shaken but determined, continued their work, until the ground itself began to shift beneath the tracks, swallowing entire beams overnight, as if the earth were reclaiming what was taken. Witnesses spoke of strange lights glowing in the fields at night, pale and low to the ground, moving like lanterns carried by invisible hands. The workers who stayed long enough described voices whispering beneath the wind, soft, feminine, repeating a single phrase over and over, "Return what was promised." Within a month, the project was abandoned, and the land was once again left to its silence. Years later, a local schoolteacher named Clara de Viriaux purchased a parcel of that same ground. Determined to prove the stories false, she built a small cottage near the ruins of the Brennan farmhouse and documented everything. The weather, the soil, the patterns of animal migration. Her journal, recovered in 1923, ends abruptly one stormy evening with a final entry: "The lilies have returned, 4 again in perfect rows. I dreamed last night that they spoke. They called my name, not as a warning, but as welcome. I think I understand now. The land doesn't curse, it chooses. It remembers the blood that binds it." Clara was never found. Only her cottage remained, empty, its walls covered in roots that had grown inward, as if the earth itself had reached inside to take her. And so the legend continued, unbroken, eternal and patient, for in Lancaster County they still say, "The Brennan land never dies, it only waits." In the autumn of 2024, developers returned to Lancaster County, this time armed with drones, geological scanners, and digital maps that promised precision where superstition once ruled. The project was ambitious, a luxury housing community called Brennan Meadows, named without irony after the long-forgotten sisters. Local opposition was mild, few remembered the old stories in detail, and those who did were dismissed as relics of an overly religious past. Progress, they said, had no patience for ghosts. The first months passed uneventfully. Surveyors marked boundaries, excavators flattened the old farmland, and marketing teams launched glossy brochures, showing families walking golden retrievers where the Brennan farmhouse once stood. Then came the interruptions, small, inexplicable, easy at first to overlook. Equipment would short circuit for no reason. Batteries drained within minutes on the property. Workers began complaining about nausea, headaches, and dreams they couldn't remember but woke from screaming. One foreman, Jason Hall, reported something stranger. He claimed to have seen 4 women standing at the edge of the property line one foggy morning, motionless, facing the rising sun. He shouted to them, but they vanished before he reached the spot. Only 4 black lilies remained where they had stood, their petals slick with dew or blood. The next day, Jason fell into a trench while inspecting soil stability. Witnesses swore the ground had simply opened beneath him. His body was never recovered. Soon, the footage from site security cameras began to glitch. At exactly 3:17 a.m. each night, every feed flickered and distorted into static. When slowed down, the static revealed faint outlines. 4 silhouettes moving in unison, their faces blurred but unmistakably human. The company's cybersecurity team dismissed it as corrupted data until the project manager, a woman named Elaine Marin, received an anonymous email containing a single attachment, a scanned page from an 1842 parish record listing the Brennan sisters, entered by the hand of God himself. Elaine, curious and increasingly unnerved, visited the site one final time before its closure. Her team found her car still running at dawn, headlights cutting through the mist. Inside, her laptop was open to a half-written email. It read, "The ground here isn't dead, it's breathing." The Brennan Meadows project was suspended indefinitely. The land, once again, was left untouched, quiet, fertile, waiting, and when the wind moves through the empty fields at night, locals swear it carries a woman's voice, low and steady, whispering, "One never left." By winter of 2025, the Brennan Meadows project had been officially abandoned. Fencing surrounded the property, warning signs flapped in the wind, and the unfinished skeletons of houses stood like gravestones against the gray horizon. Yet, the town of Lancaster itself, older now, quieter, had begun to feel the echo. Strange weather patterns rolled through the valley, sudden fogs that smelled faintly of iron, frost that formed symbols in the dirt, and an unnatural hum beneath the soil that residents said you could feel through your shoes if you stood still long enough. At first, people blamed construction runoff or underground gas lines, but explanations faltered when the dreams began. Dozens of residents, from schoolteachers to retirees, reported seeing the same thing: 4 women, walking across the fields beneath a red moon, their dresses fluttering though there was no wind. They spoke no words, but their presence left a heaviness that followed the dreamers into waking life. Nosebleeds, insomnia, and in some cases, spontaneous fainting spells. Then came the disappearances. 2 teenagers, exploring the restricted site for a social media challenge, never returned. Their phones were found days later, buried beneath several inches of newly turned soil, each recording the same haunting audio: 4 voices, overlapping, whispering, "Balance the debt." Town officials organized a search party, though most volunteers refused to go after dark. Among them was Father Alden, the local priest, who believed the haunting was a remnant of something ancient, older than sin, older than salvation. He brought holy water and scripture, but what he found only deepened the fear. Near the ruins of the old Brennan farmhouse, the earth had cracked open in 4 symmetrical lines, forming a perfect square. From within came a low vibration, like a heartbeat, and in its center grew 4 black lilies, untouched by frost. Father Alden fled, returning to town pale and trembling, repeating only one phrase: "It's awake now." That night, every church bell in Lancaster rang out at once. 12 strokes. Though no hands touched them, power failed across the entire county. From the fields, a soft red light began to rise, spreading through the fog like blood in water. And then, as the townsfolk watched from their windows in terrified silence, a woman's voice, clear, calm, and inescapable, drifted across the wind, whispering the words that had haunted Lancaster For nearly 2 centuries, the land remembers. The red light that rose from the Brennan fields did not fade with dawn. It lingered, pulsing faintly like an ember that refused to die. By the following evening, the entire town of Lancaster was caught in its glow. The street lamps flickered in rhythm with it. Animals refused to leave their stalls, and the air carried a faint vibration that made windows hum. People gathered in small groups, afraid to sleep, afraid to pray. It felt as if the ground beneath them had begun to breathe again. At 9:03 p.m., the first house went dark. The Carters, who lived nearest to the old property, were the first to vanish. Neighbors later described seeing their lights go out one by one, followed by the faint sound of a woman humming a lullaby, old and Irish. When a deputy arrived, he found the front door open, dinner still warm on the table, and a trail of soil leading from the kitchen to the yard. No bodies, no footprints leaving the property, just the faint scent of lilies. Throughout the night, reports flooded the sheriff's office, doors opening by themselves, voices calling from empty fields, mirrors cracking in perfect spirals. Power stations on the edge of town failed without cause. The hospital generator flickered, leaving entire wings in darkness. And then, at precisely midnight, the fog rolled in, a dense, blood-colored mist that swallowed every street. Witnesses who survived that night described seeing figures moving through the fog. 4 women, always together, their gowns flowing like smoke, faces pale and blurred by the red glow. They did not speak, but when they passed, the earth beneath them shifted, softening, swallowing footprints whole. Those who tried to confront them were overcome by hallucinations, voices whispering from beneath the soil, hands reaching from the ground. By dawn, half the town had vanished. Those who remained gathered at the church on the hill, praying, though even the priest's voice trembled. From the valley below came a low, continuous rumble, as if the land itself were exhaling, and when the morning sun finally pierced the fog, what had been Brennan Meadows was gone. In its place stretched an untouched field of wild grass. No houses, no roads, no signs of human work. Only 4 black lilies growing in the center, glistening in the dew. The earth had fed. The debt was balanced, for now. The disappearance of Brennan Meadows was recorded, then erased. Within a week, county officials declared the land unfit for habitation, citing seismic instability and gas emissions. Yet no geological survey was ever conducted. The federal authorities who arrived 2 days later sealed the area under martial supervision, confiscated every map, and quietly purchased the surrounding land through shell corporations. The name Brennan vanished from public records. What couldn't be erased, however, were the memories of those who survived that night. Men who woke to find their wives missing, children whose drawings showed faceless women standing in red mist, and priests who refused to enter their own churches ever again. In 1842, the U.S. Geological Survey published a single paragraph about the event, localized sinkhole phenomena of unknown origin, area reclaimed by nature. But survivors told a different story. They claimed the government came not to investigate, but to contain. Witnesses swore they saw men in black uniforms digging trenches at the meadow's edge, filling them with lime, salt, and something that hissed when wet. The smell of burning earth lingered for weeks. By spring, the field was fenced off and marked with one sign, restricted. For decades, the land was omitted from county maps. Travelers passing through spoke of strange lights flickering above the grass at night, and of a melody, soft, mournful, unmistakably feminine, carried on the wind. When farmers tried to plow nearby, their tools rusted overnight. Horses refused to step within sight of the fence. Even birds avoided it, flying in wide arcs as though obeying an invisible boundary. But the true erasure came through narrative. The story of the Brennan sisters was rewritten by time, recast as superstition, Irish folklore, rural hysteria, whispers of witches in a Protestant county. Scholars dismissed it, Newspapers ignored it, and churches condemned anyone who dared to repeat it. A new town was built a few miles north, named Millfield, as if to overwrite the past, yet the corruption beneath never stopped breathing. Local historians later discovered inconsistencies in land deeds signed by county judges, bankers, and lawyers, all names tied to the original 4 victims. The very institutions that buried the story had profited from its silence, because what disappeared that night wasn't just a family farm. It was evidence of ownership transferred through death, of inheritance through ritual, of power older than the Republic itself. They say the land keeps memory. But in Lancaster County, the land remembers blood. Every generation since 1837, the fields surrounding the vanished Brennan Meadows have quietly claimed another heir, a surveyor in 1879 who uncovered fragments of blackened bone beneath the soil, a preacher's wife in 1902 who vanished while gathering lilies, a state historian in 1933 who disappeared after publishing an article titled, "The Sisters of Sin." Their names were erased from archives, their graves unmarked, but each was traced, by blood or marriage, to one of the original families. The curse wasn't revenge, it was continuation. For what the Brennan sisters began wasn't murder. It was transference. They believed that inheritance was not wealth but possession. That the essence of ownership required renewal through sacrifice. When their husbands died, they didn't simply inherit their property. They absorbed their will, their ambition, their spiritual claim. Land didn't pass through law, it passed through death. That belief, whispered in Irish midnight rituals and ancient Gaelic blood oaths, was older than Christianity, older than empire. By performing those rituals under the red fog, the sisters didn't just bind the property to their name, they merged with it. Their consciousness rooted into the soil itself, feeding on fear, on greed, on the corruption that men brought with them. That's why the government sealed the ground, why the church forbade mention of it, because power that doesn't need permission, law, or title is the one thing every institution fears. Even now, satellite imagery of the restricted area shows anomalies. Heat signatures that pulse like heartbeats, electromagnetic interference when anyone tries to scan the terrain. Locals say that sometimes, on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of women singing under the earth, 4 voices rising in perfect harmony. But there's something darker. Every 99 years, the soil renews itself through human presence. 1936 was the last cycle. The next is now. The fences have rusted, the surveillance cameras blink static, and the Department of Energy quietly lists the area as inactive. And here's where your awareness becomes your initiation. If you've listened this far, you've entered the circle of knowing. Type this in the comments. The land remembers. Do it twice, once for what's buried, once for what's awakening. Because in Lancaster County, the ground doesn't keep secrets, it keeps promises. Would you like me to continue with a hidden epilogue? A cryptic postscript that hints at the sisters' survival in modern form.